Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 19th, where we are putting some closure onto speech number 1 and getting ready for speech number 2. So as you know, speech number 1, the informative speech, I've asked you to post that onto our Moodle site and also send me your outline via email. So your final outline, the one you would have actually used for delivering your speech. So if you haven't already done so, please send that to me and I will be reviewing your speeches and sending you back feedback shortly. And your job for today's attendance question is to watch your peers' speeches. By this point, everybody should have uploaded their speech and should have taken care of any technological difficulties they might have experienced. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and again, you'll see this at the bottom of our notes, and I'll repeat it at the ending of today's class, is to watch all of the speeches from your peers and to send me via email so that it's private, one strength and one weakness for each of the speeches that you viewed, and I will compile all of that data and then I will present it to you so that you can get a sense as to what your classmates thought. In terms of thinking about our next class, just to jump ahead a little bit, we're going to be watching some sample speeches, and they will be the informative speeches, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm also going to be posting our second quiz, and as you know, it's open book, open notes. And lastly, I am asking you to contact me up until any point prior to the 2nd of November so that we can discuss speech number 2. And as you know, it can be very informal. It can just be a brief email exchange about what you're planning to do with your second speech, the 10-minute informative speech. But if you'd like something a little bit more detailed, we can meet via phone or via Zoom. And you can even present a sample speech if you so wanted to. So I let you decide how much or how little support you'd like from me in terms of your second speech. The first speech, the whole point of that was for you to be able to not only introduce yourself to the class a little bit more formally than the introductions that we did on the very beginning or in the very beginning of the semester when that was your first discussion question. But the purpose of that speech was also so that you can incorporate some of the speech techniques that we've been talking about thus far. And of course, by not only presenting your speech, but watching the speeches of all of your peers, I think you'll have a good foundation on some of the techniques for speech delivery. So now we can expand and develop a little bit with an informative speech. This is a speech in which you teach us something. And this speech will be twice the length, 10 minutes. And you are going to be asked to use at least one audio or one visual aid, which I will be talking about today. Now, you might have elected to use an audio or visual for your first speech, but you weren't required to. I wanted to make sure that you didn't have yet one more thing to think about. But now that you've had some experience with delivering speeches, now we can begin to talk a little bit about how we would incorporate audios or visuals, which are particularly helpful in terms of learning styles, which you might have heard of before. People learn in different ways. Some people learn through oral means. Some people learn through visual means. It's one of the reasons why I have the notes below all of the videos so that you can read them as well as listen to the videos and hear them. And in terms of that informative speech, you don't have a whole lot of time, 10 minutes, but you'd be surprised at how much you can teach or how much you can learn in 10 minutes. So, chapter 12 of the edition of the textbook that I had ordered talks about the informative speech. And in fact, at least in this edition on page 196, it talks about some possibilities of what you can teach us about. Perhaps you wanted to teach us about a famous person or a particular place or a thing. Maybe it's something like an event or an idea or a procedure. It could be something that you've learned in another class or you are learning. It could be something that you already have some prior knowledge about. That said, if you always wanted to learn about something and you never had the opportunity, this might be the opportunity for you to learn something about it. So I'll also be talking about using outside resources very briefly, but you won't be required to use outside resources until our third and final speech, which happens to be the persuasive speech. But you might need to do some investigation, and if so, I wanted you to have that information. So, lots of different ways you can go about this. You can give an explanation, which is to tell us. You can do a demonstration, which is to show us. Or you can do a combination of the two. Regardless, I suggest that you limit your points because 10 minutes is not a whole lot of time. You use transitions between your points so that you can draw clear connections. You avoid jargon or specialized language. Assume you're presenting to a general audience, even though there might be a specialist in the audience, let's say a nurse or a nursing student might be in the audience, but you shouldn't use a lot of medical terms because you should be assuming that you've got a general audience. Cluster-like ideas, one of those memory techniques, clustering, in order to help us improve our poor memories. Again, anything you can do to help the audience remember, though this is also useful to you to help you remember when you're presenting your speech. So if you can group like ideas together. Associate new ideas with old ideas. That's an old teaching trick, especially for something like, let's say, a mathematics class, where concepts usually build upon one another. Use repetition, probably more so than you would do with writing, because repetition really is the way, or one of the ways, that we go about memorizing things. Address different learning styles, as I had suggested earlier. So some people learn through seeing, some people learn through hearing, some people learn through doing. Ideally, the more learning styles you can address, the better off you are. And motivate your audience. Sometimes your audience already has an internal motivation, but oftentimes your audience may not share the same interests that you have in your subject matter. This is a problem that confronts teachers all of the time. That, for instance, I'll just take Shakespeare, which is a class that I teach, where sometimes it's difficult to motivate students to have an engagement with Shakespeare, and I'm well aware of that the purpose of the class is probably to satisfy requirement for many of the students in the course, not necessarily all. And I have 16 weeks to try to convince the audience that Shakespeare talks about timeless and universal themes that you can transfer over into other elements of your life and the workplace. I don't know how necessarily effective I am, but I certainly try. And the idea is that perhaps that speech that I had mentioned earlier, the motivation or the shocking speech, used motivation quite nicely. If you remember, I had told you about one of my former students who basically staged a fake choking episode in class so that the upcoming speaker could pretend to perform the Heimlich maneuver and then calmly walk up to the front of the room and declare that their speech was about the Heimlich maneuver. And it was brilliant. Of course, a lot of planning went into it. Another peer was pretending to choke. And then the student who was giving the speech pretended to perform the Heimlich, because you can actually break ribs performing the Heimlich. And the reality was that all of us had huge motivation after that to listen to a subject that might be rather dry, performing the Heimlich maneuver, if for no other reason we had all experienced, or we thought we experienced, an episode just minutes earlier where we would need that information. And it turns out we didn't, but of course we still had great engagement. So it was quite clever. So in terms of visual media, you have a lot of options, and visual media also includes audio. You can go from low tech to high tech. Low tech being things like using poster boards. But keep in mind that we do have a certain level of expectation of professionalism. So the days of just scribbling something on a piece of paper are over. You can use props, though you have to think about the size and the scale of the prop, assuming that it would be appropriate. You could use a whiteboard. Now, I know that you're not in a classroom setting, but you might have access to something like a whiteboard, or even the old-fashioned version of PowerPoint, which used to be a flipboard, where we would have basically several sheets of paper gathered together on a pad, large sheets, and they would usually be on an easel. And then the speaker could determine when to reveal new sheets of information. So sometimes low tech works just fine. Pictures can be very persuasive, usually for emotional responses. Again, you have to think about size and scale. Video and audio clips can be very effective. Think about balance. So if you've got a 10-minute speech, I'd say you probably don't want to spend more than 3 minutes or so with audios or visuals. So while you might be tempted to show a 10-minute video clip, that wouldn't be appropriate for a 10-minute speech. Perhaps it would be appropriate for, let's say, an hour-long speech. The flip chart that I was talking about earlier, the early version of PowerPoint, I have no problems with PowerPoint, though I've oftentimes seen PowerPoint misused, and I suspect you have your own horror stories with PowerPoint, where either there's just too much text. PowerPoint is just supposed to focus on keywords and phrases, much like your speaking outline. The PowerPoint is not supposed to substitute for your delivery. Or perhaps it's that they're using too many fonts and they're using too many colors, so it becomes too disorienting. Or perhaps there are technological difficulties. So there can be all kinds of issues with PowerPoint. There is the possibility of Zoom screen sharing as well, particularly if you're recording via Zoom. Obviously, this is not a face-to-face class, so you have to think about what is the best way that you could translate over some of these options into video. Keep in mind, though, that if you do use something like video, let's say PowerPoint, the focus should be on you, not on the PowerPoint slides. So you don't want to have a little tiny box in the corner with your face and then a huge PowerPoint slide. It should be the other way around. The idea that you're focusing on your face and the PowerPoint slide is smaller. You don't want the slide or the PowerPoint to be overwhelming you. We want to see your facial expressions because this is a speech delivery class. So some suggestions, regardless of the audio or the visual that you use, be professional. And handouts can be very nice. Obviously, this is something that you can't really do easily from an electronic perspective. I suppose you could add some text at the bottom of your video and direct us to that. That could be a kind of handout. Handouts work very nicely when you want the audience to take away something, or when you're dealing with very sensitive information. You don't necessarily think your audience would feel comfortable writing it down or being seen writing it down. Test your equipment beforehand. There always is the possibility of technological difficulties. This is one of the ways that you have an advantage, because if you experience a technological difficulty, you can re-record. If you were in a face-to-face situation, you wouldn't be able to do that, and you'd have to basically just adapt to the best of your abilities. You certainly couldn't expect an audience to leave and come back at another time. Always have a backup plan. And I always suggest that your speaking notes be in hard copy rather than on a screen, just because if you have technological difficulties, which I've also seen with PowerPoint, where the sync is completely off, that's just a painful experience. So always have a backup plan, and certainly I think having a hard copy of your speaking outline is much more useful than relying on a screen. So if there are technological difficulties, then you can rely on your hard copy. And I practice what I preach. I'm literally using the notes that I post. It would be backwards, however, because of the camera. The notes that I post below the video, I've got right in front of me, and these are my cues about what to discuss with you. Charts work very nicely for numbers. They help individuals visualize the conceptual ideas behind numbers. Pictures, as I had indicated earlier, work very well for emotions. And we tend to be both a mixture of intellect and emotion. Be simple, be clear, be neat. Consider your scale, the balance and proportion. Yes, you can use color for interest, but not too much color so that you're overwhelming us. Avoid all capitals in your text. I don't know if you've ever read a paper that's written in all capitals. Just about every English teacher has, I can tell you. And it's very challenging. So you want to make sure that you're just saving all capitals for important pieces of information. And what studies have shown is that if you want to make something really visible to an audience, they're more likely to retain it if you bold it than if you underline it. So that's an interesting piece of advice, thinking about your audio and visual. So in terms of the informative speech, I oftentimes recommend that you might want to talk about something that you already have some prior knowledge of so that you can save some time. But that said, you don't necessarily have to. And of course, we can be talking about this when you reach out to me about your second speech and what you're planning on discussing and what audio visual you're planning on using. Obviously, you can see that you will probably know the information less well than you did with your first speech, which was an autobiographical speech. That's done purposely. I wanted you to be very familiar with the topic, in other words, yourself, when you were first practicing public speaking skills. So now that we are expanding and developing, you don't necessarily need to know the subject matter as well as you would know your own life history. But certainly, the better you know the subject matter, the more comfortable you are presenting it. And it all goes back to the Toastmasters video that we saw at the beginning of the semester. Practice, practice, practice. The more familiar you are with the content, the better off you are. And again, you want to try to maintain as much eye contact with your camera as possible. So, as I had indicated, some of you might elect to do some outside research, though some of you might elect to talk about a topic that you already have knowledge of, so you're not required to use outside research. You will be required to use outside research for our third and final speech. That's the persuasive speech. If nothing else, outside sources help to enhance credibility, as we will discuss. And it also helps to enhance persuasiveness because it enhances credibility. So if you're using some outside sources before we get to the third speech, because we will revisit this, here are some suggestions. Check for accuracy. Don't just go on Google and take the first hit. In fact, this is my plug for using the GCC library databases. These are not available to the general public, even though you can and should and need to access them online. There is a paywall that you don't have to worry about because your tuition dollars pay for that. And this is why most private citizens don't have access to databases because they're prohibitively expensive. And the reason why they're expensive is because they hire staffs of people to verify the authenticity of the information, which is an advantage that you don't get in the wide open net. I'll never forget how someone once compared using the wide open net as compared to using a database. That a database was much like engaging in protected sex. And that means that, yes, something could go wrong, but it's unlikely. And that being on the wide open net would be much like having unprotected sex. That the risk is much higher of something going wrong. And do you really want to take that risk? And I really can't think of a better connection or a better description of using the internet. I think that's a very nice way of sort of thinking about it. Use verbal tags when you are using outside resources. In other words, you want to cue us in that you are using an outside resource. And it could be as simple as saying something like, according to experts. I mean, anything that follows that statement obviously is not your original work. The good news is that when we talk about citing sources, it's much easier to do in an oral situation than in a written situation. I'm sure you've probably had some experience with this with writing papers, that there's a lot of minutia that you need to consider when you are documenting your outside resources. But again, keep in mind that the situation of presenting to an audience live is going to be different than presenting to an audience in written form. They aren't going to, your live audience, want to be overwhelmed with things like publisher, place of publication, something that you should eventually include in your written sources. When we get to the persuasive speech, I will talk about how you can include this information in your speaking outline just so that I can briefly review it. But keep in mind that your speaking outline is not usually something you share with the general public. So that said, you should have access to it. So if somebody were to ask you in your audience, you could provide them with enough information so they can verify your sources. But in the end, you want to be simple and clear and just cue your audience in when you're using something that is not your original work. And in terms of outside resources, you have lots of options. Books still exist, as well as magazine articles in physical form. Of course, most people go almost immediately to the internet, and I'm not averse to the internet. You just need to use some caution to make sure that you're using authentic and valid information. And ideally, if you were doing a large project, you would use a mixture of print and electronic resources so that you can verify off of one another. When we get to the persuasive speech, you'll see I'm going to ask for only 3. So you don't necessarily need to use any specific kind of combination. So you could decide to use 3 websites, let's say. You wouldn't have to use 1 book and 2 websites if you didn't so want to. But again, it's a very short speech, though it might not seem so from your perspective. The persuasive speech will be 15 minutes long, but you'd be surprised how quickly that time goes, particularly when you are referencing outside sources. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but in the event of your thinking about outside resources, interviews also count as outside resources. Again, you want to make sure that you are showing ethos and you're being ethical, that you have the permission of your interview subject to interview them. They're aware of how you're going to be using that information and in what context, and you have their permission to use their names, and if not, you give them a pseudonym. And of course, your interview should be about something that's relevant to the subject of the speech. You don't want to just interview somebody merely for the sake of interviewing. 2 different kinds of evidence. One is not necessarily better than another. They're just different. There's qualitative, and those are usually anecdotes or stories. And quantitative, those are usually facts. And again, I think both serve their purpose. So if you want to think about quantitative facts about, let's say, a college, things like graduation rates and transfer rates. If you want to think about qualitative ways to measure a college, you can think about things like class evaluations, particularly the section where you write your own comments. And again, one isn't better than another. They're just different. Just like primary accounts and secondary accounts. Primary accounts are first-hand eyewitness accounts. And of course, there's a certain level of validity to that because the person actually experienced and saw it with their own eyes. But there also is some subjectivity and bias associated with that. There are also secondary accounts, which is usually what scholarship is about. They are based on the primary accounts, where you put together all of the first-hand accounts and then you create something like a research paper. And again, both have their place. Certainly, I can see interviewing a soldier about their experience in war. The primary account would be important in terms of understanding that war because they lived it. But the secondary account, the scholarship about that war, which gives a much broader view than just one's individual viewpoint, is also useful. So it's not that one is better than another. These are just different kinds of evidence that you can use. So basically, where we are now is getting ready to watch speech number 1 from your classmates. So that will be the attendance question that you will answer, but not on our discussion forum. Please send that to me privately via my email, and then I will compile all that data and then be able to present you what the most common strengths and weaknesses were from your classmates. That would be due Saturday, the 21st of October, but certainly, as always, if you need an extension, please let me know, and I'll be happy to grant that to you. So watch speech number 1 posted by your classmates, which is in the top Moodle section, and briefly indicate one strength and one weakness of each speech, and send that to my email by Saturday, the 21st. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Next class, we'll see some sample informative speeches, and we'll also have a quiz. Take care. Bye-bye.